Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Balconia Garden Podcast. This is where we talk about all things container gardening, both indoor and outdoor. You can find tips and tricks for growing a flourishing container garden, regardless of its size, shape, or the space that you have. You can find video tutorials on my YouTube channel. It's called Balconia Garden, and you can listen to this episode on the YouTube channel and on Spotify. The account is called Balconia Garden Podcast. Welcome to episode 7. It's March. The weather has been glorious in Cologne. We're actually, Carnival is happening in Cologne right now. So you might hear in the background in my area, they're doing the parade today. So I was out enjoying it earlier in the glorious sun. So yeah, if you hear a bit of noise in the background, it's just people enjoying themselves. So that's good. But it really is starting to feel like spring here. And I am so happy about that. So this month, I'm going to be posting lots about seed sowing and seedlings, because this is now the time where we're going to start to sow seeds, start to really get going on our container gardens. Because yeah, I mean, we're coming towards the official start of spring, and we can really start preparing for our container gardens. So I thought we could start today with what I consider to be a really important question, and that is, when do I start sowing my seeds? So we're going to look at when to do that and how to know when to sow your seeds. Because what can happen around this time, you've probably already seen it, but if you're on social media, if you watch YouTube or you have Instagram, you might see a lot of garden or gardeners online already posting, oh, I've sown my seeds and the seedlings are already coming up. And then you sort of get this panic, oh my God, am I behind? Are my seeds not going to germinate in time? And we really have to understand that when we sow our seeds, it's so dependent on where we live. So don't worry if you're seeing others doing all this activity. Every garden, every container garden is different, even if it's indoors. So yes, we're going to look at how to know when to sow your seeds. There is a difference between when we start to sow seeds indoors and outdoors. And of course, this entire podcast is actually in the channel, we're looking at gardening through the lens of container gardening, not in the open soil. It is slightly different. There are different things we need to think about. So let's get to it. So how are we going to figure out when to sow our seeds? Generally speaking, when you sow your seeds will be determined by the last frost date in your area. You can find this out online. You just have to type in your zone or the area that you're living in and search for the last frost date. It will, of course, be an estimate. So keep that in mind. Mother Nature, she does her thing. But it will roughly be around this time. Frost is something that will damage or kill most seedlings. Seedlings are still very sensitive. They're vulnerable to these harsher conditions, especially if we've started them off indoors. So it pays to know this date. And also, don't be fooled. If you've had nice weather, say for a week or 2 weeks, but you still haven't reached the last frost date, don't be fooled, because you can get a cold snap, and if you've planted your seedlings out before, then yeah, there's a chance that you could lose them, which is a shame. So let's look at what we would do if we were sowing indoors. So say you're sowing you're sowing cabbage seeds, you're starting them off indoors. And on the seed packet, or if you've done a bit of research, you see that the seeds need around 4 to 6 weeks to grow into strong enough seedlings for them to then be planted out with the best chance of survival. So they've got nice leaves on them. They've developed a really lovely root system. So what we would do is we would then calculate 4 to 6 weeks before our last frost date in our area. And that's when we would sow our seeds, more or less. And if you've got your journal, you can also start writing these dates, and it's just going to keep you right. Also, something important to remember is when we're sowing indoors and we want to then plant our seedlings outdoors, we have to remember that the seedlings will need to be hardened off. Hardening off is where we gradually expose our indoor seedlings to outdoor environments. I normally do this over a 1 to 2 week period. It's when you take your seedlings that have grown up indoors and you put them outside for a couple of hours, let them get used to the weather. I would always start on a kind of nice sunny, calm day, and then bring them back inside after a few hours, and then just gradually lengthen that time that they're outside. Because if we've sown them inside, they've had beautiful, warm, stable conditions, and then the outdoor environment will be a bit of a shock for them at first. So we need to allow them this time to adjust to their new homes. So hardening off is also a really important part. Because this last frost date is always an estimate, there can be times where we'll get another cold snap after this frost date. So what I always did on the balcony was I used sort of these mini DIY greenhouses, basically just clear plastic boxes varying in size depending on what I was growing. And if it got really cold, I would just cover the pots and protect them. And I mean, you can do that anyway. I did a video on that. I will link it down below. As I say, I think in almost every podcast, it's growing in containers is different from growing in the soil because the plants and especially the roots are not nearly as protected when they're growing in a container as they would be if they were growing in the open soil. So we do need to protect them more, especially in spring where the weather can be up and down. So by using something like a horticultural fleece or a DIY greenhouse, or even if you have enough space and you have a cold frame, just anything to make sure that the seeds are protected from any last minute frost. So that's how we would do indoor sowing. If we're doing outdoor sowing or direct sowing, there are of course many seeds that actually prefer to be planted directly into their forever place or pot. They don't like being pricked out, they don't like being moved. What I found is just really using this last frost date applies here too. There are other indicators as to when you can sow your seeds. For example, the outdoor soil temperatures. Some seeds can actually tolerate light frosts, like peas and some types of beans, but I found that sticking to this last frost date is just a really simple way. But again, like if it gets really cold, this is the beauty of container gardening. You can just bring your pots inside if they're small enough and then put them outside when the weather gets warmer. So that is how I always figure out when to sow my seeds, both indoors and outdoors. I hope that helped. The next episode, we're going to look at what a seed needs to germinate. So I'm going to share some tips about that. Thank you for listening. I hope you're all staying safe and well. I'll send you all my good wishes and I'll connect with you in the next podcast. Goodbye.